Hello, listeners, and welcome to this bonus episode of the Cult Vault. I'm your speaker, Casey, and if you get 5 minutes, please follow the link in the episode description to complete the short survey that is discussed in this episode. Today, Ed talks us through academic studies in the field of new religious movements, cult rhetoric, and some inspiring reading material. So I hope you enjoy. Hi, Ed, and thank you so much for joining me today. Our episode is taking a slightly different approach as I speak with you, an academic, about some of the do's and don'ts of this profession. So would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ed. I'm just coming to the end of my PhD at the University of Central Lancashire, and my research focuses on minority religions and empowerment.
And what is it that drew you to this particular topic in the first place?
Yeah, I have kind of an interesting route in, which is very different to other academics. So I am actually a believing and practicing Christian, and went to university, wanted to study religious studies, and just found my ability to be objective with research into Christianity was limited. Because different people have different opinions about the Bible, which is great, and that's fine, and we welcome that. But I think when I was young, and I was around 19, 20, I was very arrogant and very sure of my own beliefs to the point where I didn't have time for other people's opinions. And so I decided to go and look into things that I knew nothing about. So I started looking at new religious movements and the different types of beliefs that they have, the different types of people that join, and it just kind of snowballed from there for me, really.
And now you're working on your PhD, so it's obviously something that has stuck with you and something you've remained passionate about to continue on your journey of further education.
Yeah, totally. I mean, for me, I think you meet lots of interesting people. You get to have lots, as you know, you get to have lots of interesting discussions. But I think as well, I think there's a lot of there's a massive gap in research because not a lot of people focus on this field, and there's also a lot of people who have, let's say, very different opinions to the ones that I have, and kind of there's like a whole anti-cult movement, and so that was a very interesting dynamic to try and work out where do I fit in this narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could see how there is a lack of research, but it's important that we talk with people such as yourself, and actually an author who I just interviewed last night as well, who's released her book called Cultish. It's important that there's still people in the field that are young and energetic and want to contribute to this research, so that when people come to me and say, why does somebody join a cult? There's new and fresh things to refer them to, because religion and spirituality and new religious movements and all of that stuff changes every single day, especially with the internet and things like that. So it's really important that people like you are interested in this field and want to learn more and contribute. But what is it specifically that you are researching for your PhD?
Yeah, so I started off, so it's been a journey. I started off researching, particularly interested in why do young people in particular find a home in many minority religions and new religious movements. But also then initially I wanted to compare that with identity politics, although that kind of avenue didn't materialize in the PhD. But what I specifically research and have gone on to research is conversion and recruitment. And so you look at groups such as the Church of Scientology or the Watchtower Society, and there's a lot of negative press about them. There's a lot of people who will say all sorts of things have happened, and yet these churches and these groups are still able to grow, maybe not grow as much as they say they're growing, because the research doesn't support that, but they are able to grow and people are still joining. You know, people will join tomorrow, next week, next month. And so I wanted to understand that. And so I have been researching that for the last 6 years now, because I did my PhD part-time, and have found that the centerpiece of why people join is because they are empowered, and that can take many different forms, and there's a whole story there. But yeah, empowerment is what I found to be the key indicator for conversion and recruitment.
And would you say that that's the main thing that you've learned on this 6-year journey?
Yeah, so I initially started the journey having a very, definite opinion of what is cult. And that was informed largely by apostate literature. It was informed by the media. I had this idea of what a cult was. And what I've now come to realize is that, it's so not what I thought it was, but there's just a group of people who are empowered to believe or empowered to belong to whatever group they find that empowerment in. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to ignore some of the atrocities and some of the awful things that can be done by people in these organizations, but it's no different to any other organization in the sense of in politics or in other, even businesses, and the way that they exploit people. There's always people at the center of stuff, and sometimes people can be crap. What I found is that the everyday experience of a religious adherent is about being empowered. And so, that's what I found.
And what do you think is next for you now that you're getting towards the end of your PhD?
Unemployment? No, I'm joking. I think more research. I think because I've kind of stumbled on this new kind of, it's not completely new, but this theory of empowerment and conversion, I think there's a lot more research that should be done to kind of verify that. I don't believe in just saying, I've interviewed this many people and therefore it's fact for everyone. I think that's not how life works. But I think, so a postdoc kind of researching that would be great. So if anyone's listening and they want to fund research into this, that'd be fantastic. Please let me know. So further research and then teaching, because I think it's one thing to research and find stuff. It's another thing entirely to then let people know about what you found. And so teaching as well. And on that note, I've kind of started this new project, which is a step away from qualitative data. And I'm looking at gaining as many respondents to a survey as possible to work out how the terms that we use to refer to these groups in modern society are still being used every day by normal people, by people outside of the ivory tower, outside of these new religious movements or cults or whatever term people use, and looking at how, your average Joe blogs in Liverpool city centre uses the terms.
And what is your personal opinion about the terminology that's used by us everyday folks?
Yeah, okay. I have many opinions on this. So somehow I have to be careful not to jade any potential respondents listening to this and their opinions. But I think in academia, I say in academia, there obviously are some academics out there who will still use the word cult, and the meaning behind that is the one that the media share. So they will use the word cult, and what they mean by that is that it's a negative group. It's got often got a leader that dictates to them what they can believe and how they can live their lives. And sure, sometimes there are new religious movements, minority religions out there that have organizational structures that enable that to happen. And we should never shy away from kind of the abuse and the stuff that happens in these groups. However, I think the word cult has become overloaded with connotations to the point that you couldn't get a fair trial. If you were a cult leader, I don't believe you can get a fair trial if you go in front of a jury. I don't believe you can get fair representation in the media, because as soon as you label something a cult, it's othered. And I think that we're in a time of flux. Identity politics is rightfully, making some massive leaps forwards. And I think, therefore, we have to be careful about the words we use, or know how everyday people are using the words, so that in academia we don't use the same words or stumble over ourselves. So I prefer the term minority religion because I don't see the need to differentiate between any religious group. And minority just means you don't have the majority share of influence in society, and you don't have the majority amount of number. Whatever you want it to mean, it just means you're a minority. So I think that's potentially more appropriate in academia. I don't think we'll get rid of the word cult, though, which is shame, really. But at the same time, I think if we can continue to not apologize for the stuff that's happened, but also continue to research objectively, I think at some point in the future, people will start to see, okay, a cult is just another religious group. And that there's an organization that sometimes goes wrong and sometimes doesn't. That's kind of where I'm at with that. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that if the survey wasn't something that was in circulation at the moment, we could probably go in depth about some specific terminology that even myself that I've used in the past, or words that are used every day by people who are explaining what a cult is, or the types of methodology and coercion techniques that are used within those types of groups and movements. But we're not going to talk about them specifically because there is a survey in circulation, which I will post on my social medias, and I will put a link in the episode description. And it's a very short survey, and it will just help Ed to collect some data around how we as everyday people, as listeners of the podcast, as maybe even members of or ex-members of a group or movement yourself, can get in touch and just give Ed some insight into the types of terminology that you use to describe cults and new religious movements yourself.
And that's the interesting thing, when you say, oh, maybe even you, if you've been in a new religious movement, you're an adherent yourself, like they're everyday people too. And I think we as researchers often forget that. And there's so much research out there where we talk about the population, the general population, and then we kind of put them in this category of, oh, but these guys have left a minority religion, or they've been involved in this group, and therefore they're a category of research. Well, they are, but at the same time, they're everyday people. So yeah, if you are listening to this and you've been in a group, please inform that survey on how the terms are used.
Yeah,
but equally,
absolutely.
I think if it helps, and if this is helpful for your podcast, like rather than talking about the survey, I could talk about some of the research that's going into my thesis just on this notion of terms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what's really interesting is some of my adherents, some of my participants use the term cult themselves when describing the group that they left, but they still have the same beliefs. So, for example, I tried to research the Church of Scientology. I really wanted to involve them because I think they are an excellent example of a minority religion that has been othered and treated, mistreated often, but also have done some things which are questionable and probably shouldn't have done, which there's loads of stuff out there for you to read. I'm sure you probably already know, but these guys, they're called free zone Scientologists. And so they are Scientologists who've left the Church of Scientology, but they're still Scientologists and still practice all the tech, all the beliefs. And they refer to the Church of Scientology as a cult, and that they were in a cult, using the way that the term is meaned in the media. Yeah. But they themselves say, no, I'm not in a cult now. This is just my belief. This is my belief system. I'm independent of that now. And so that is a really interesting example of how everyday people use the word cult in the popular sense, but at the same time still have the same belief. And often a lot of these guys will refer to other minority religions as cults if they don't agree with the belief system. And so I think just the word is there's just so many meanings for it now that it kind of doesn't help. It doesn't really give us any information when we use the word.
It doesn't. And I remember when I did the first episode of this podcast way back when, and it was just an episode on what is a cult, because I thought if I'm going to call the podcast The Cult Vault and talk about things like Jonestown and those really infamous groups that were labeled cults in the media and created cult hysteria and have caused the word to change, you know, from the etymology that the word has from you know, back to ancient Greek and Roman times, is completely different to what it was in the 70s, and is also completely different again now in 2020, because it still holds a lot of the connotations that it gained in the 70s, 80s and 90s from things that happened around sort of Jonestown and Heaven's Gate and the Ant Hill kids and the just really nefarious, infamous things that happened. But it's interesting because when I went to do that first episode on what is a cult, I tried to make it as black and white as possible, but that's not possible. It's not something that you can do. There's so many different meanings, there's so many different descriptions. Professionals will summarize it differently. You've just talked about it differently there to anybody I've spoken to before, so it's really not something you can just put in a box and say this is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, very early on in my research, I read the work of Campbell, and he actually suggests that the word cult is literally like a rug under which all the undesirable kind of different religious expressions can be swept. And it becomes a catch-all term for anything that would be considered deviant or undesirable or not mainstream. And I think, and it equally, like I said earlier, when you attach the label cult to something, it becomes negative. And so me and my colleagues, we have a bit of a joke where we call it the C word. Obviously there is a different C word, but it's kind of a swear word to us now, because as soon as you use it, you've ruined your research. And in my research, if someone is really looking for something to help them get to sleep, they're more than welcome to read my thesis when it's published. But they and hopefully it will get published as a book. But I only ever use the word cult in inverted commas, because I just need to make sure that whoever's reading knows I am not using that term, but it is a term that we cannot avoid. And I think, and it is unfortunate in academia in particular, and lots of people won't know this, but there has been a very silent cult war that's taken place in the literature, in all of the research since probably around the 70s. It's taken place in courtrooms. It's taken place in academic journals. And there is a huge divide. Some academics fall on the side of still saying it's negative, brainwashing is a real thing, etc., etc. And then there's people like me and others like Eileen Barker, absolute Goliaths in the field. Eileen Barker, George Cosides, who've done so much research to show the impact that this can have on civil liberties, the impact that this can have on freedom and religious expression in general. And yeah, it's crazy when you actually read both sides. The amount of shots they fire at each other as well. I'm good. Arfes, like I fire a few shots towards Hassan in my thesis, because I just think that the way he approaches things is very, very biased. But I would always defend his right to publish. I would always defend his right to say these things, because I think that's what makes academia. But I very firmly and clearly, as you know, I'm on a certain side of the Cold, of the aftermath of the Cold War. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Like you said, so much.
And you mentioned before that you were hoping that your research would be published into a book, and that is actually one of my questions about whether you have any journals published at the moment, or what your hopes are for what will happen with your research once it's completed.
Yeah, totally. I hope I've come across super confident, but you know what? The honest answer is that there's, up until very recently, I've been very, very scared of publishing. Partly because I had loads of horror stories about how your research idea gets nicked and then you don't get to have all the credit. And I was being a bit like, oh, I want it, I've worked hard on it. But actually, there's also an aspect of just, you know, I look at people like Eileen Barker and these guys that I mentioned, and I just think, how am I ever going to publish anything that is useful? And it's only through some friends recently who've kind of, you know, really encouraged me. So I've only just started publishing, and I have loads of publications that will be coming out over the next 2 years. Books take ages to publish, but then I've got some journal articles out this year. But I have one with a colleague of mine, Dr. Aled Thomas, who did his research on free zone Scientology and auditing. And we've actually used our research to start a discussion about the state of religious studies as a whole, because obviously, you know, you've got terms that aren't used properly. You've got some people are sociologists, some people are religious studies, some people are theologians, and we're all at loggerheads with each other. So my publications at the moment are centered around that. And later on in the year, we'll publish the survey findings. It all depends. I'm having a baby soon, so it all depends on how easy I find continuing to work at home with baby, and then jobs and all sorts of stuff. So lots of publications coming out, and lots are in the pipeline. But I actually only have a couple out at the moment, and that main one is the one that starts the discussion. It's in the Old TAC journal. It's entitled Rogue, and it's open access. So anyone can read it for free.
That's amazing. You'll have to send me a link so that I can post that into the episode description as well.
Yeah, of course.
So you sent me over loads of resources, and my website, actually, it's not April yet, but it will have been April by the time this episode is released. But my website launches in April, and it includes a little bit about the podcast and about how the podcast came to be and things like that. But it mostly focuses on resources for people who are leaving their own groups or movements. So I've made a list of some of the books and titles you sent over to me, so I can include them as resources for academic sort of research or reading on the website. But if you had to pick sort of like a top 5 kind of pile of books to recommend to people who were really looking to get into the nitty-gritty deep stuff, what would you recommend?
Well, the first thing I'd recommend is a website called the Information, let me remember this, Information Network Focus on Religious Movements, Inform for short. And they often have seminars it's all online now, isn't it? But seminars that are free at the moment. You can donate. But they have previously had government funding, and basically their website, we're a group of academics that work with Inform, there's loads of us, to do exactly what you're saying about your website, but not necessarily about signposting specifically for individuals who are looking to leave, but more about, well, what are these groups in the first place? And so sometimes the government actually approaches Inform and says, can you do research here? We need to know what this group's doing. What do we need to do in terms of policy? So that that was launched by Eileen Barker, Eileen Barker, the second recommendation, she is basically the queen, the queen, or you know, she might be offended if she listens to this, but the queen mother of the field now. So she's recently retired, but she launched this group, but she's done lots of research, and her initial monograph, which was called The Making of a Moonie, it was published in 1984, and it looks like that. I mean, your podcast listeners can't hear that, but and so she
badge,
was the first,
on the front of the book, the badge.
And she was the first one who basically said, brainwashing or choice, and that's kind of the subtitle of the book. And she came to the conclusion that there is no brainwashing. These guys chose this group, and that launched what became. She was part of what became known as the Cult Wars. And so the third book I'd recommend, which is an Inform book, is I I picked up the wrong one. It's by Eugene Gallagher. Was edited by Eugene Gallagher. I'll give you links to all of these, by the way.
Amazing.
So you can put them in your info. And it's called Cult Wars in Historical Perspective. It's got sometimes the covers of these books don't get decided by the authors, but it's just a standard kind of textbook. It's very short and very easy to read. The whole idea of Inform is that we write so that people can understand.
Absolutely, yeah.
Writing. I think it's only 150 or so pages. Really, really small book. How many is that so far? 3,
That's
I think.
3.
So the fourth one then is it's part of the another Inform series book, but it's called A Historical Introduction to the Study of New Religious Movements. Came out recently, I think, actually. Let's see the dates. Came out 2019.
Okay.
And so this is kind of like the history so far of new religious movements. And obviously, as we know, new religious movements is a synonymous term for a lot of people with cults, whether we like that or not as academics. And then finally, because he'd kill me if I didn't recommend it, because he's a good friend of mine. But there's a book coming out in April by Dr. Alan Thomas. And he's going to kill me more for not remembering the title, but essentially it's looking at free zone Scientologies, and he looks at how the Church of Scientology has now started to change because people are kind of breaking away and creating their own sects of Scientology,
right,
which is an essential process that we've seen happen in Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and what we call world religions, despite not liking that term either. And so, he's identified that they're on this journey, and there's people who have emerged who've kind of taken the technology and the beliefs and kind of fitted it to a different everyday expression. And he writes amazingly accessibly. Like, is that even a best way of phrasing that? I don't even know if that's
the author I spoke to yesterday. She said she strives to write in a way that's juicy and digestible. Yeah,
absolutely. And Alan, my friend Alan, he does that. And I think he doesn't necessarily. Often, those of us who are linked to Inform and those of us in the field of sociology get called cult apologists by Hassan and others. But actually, he doesn't necessarily hold any punches. If he needs to, make a claim or make a statement, he'll do it, and he's not scared of doing so. Mm-hmm. And he's been a massive encouragement to me not to do the same in my research, because why hide from things that are true?
If it's your research with your name on it as well, then it's best that your stance comes across, I suppose. But one last question before we finish up, and I ask you if there's anything you want to add. If there was anybody listening who thought to themselves that this is potentially a route of higher education that they would like to pursue, where would you start in terms of, like, even at the level of college courses or foundation courses before university or any type of accreditation? Like, where would you go for what would the course titles sound like? Where would you be able to find them? And then in terms of university, what would those degrees sound like? What would they look like for people to be able to learn all about sort of the things that we've discussed today?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. The starting point is sociology A level. And if your school or college also has religious studies, do both of them at the same time, and even psychology, because the three combined, prepares you with enough kind of multidisciplinary kind of knowledge to then do well at an undergrad. I think there's 2 ways to go about it. Okay, and I'll try and be as brief as possible for your listeners to not bore them. But option 1 is to look at some of these recommended books, look at who they're referencing, and look at where these guys teach. A lot of the English authors are still active and teaching, although they are getting on a bit, and there's some new ones of us coming through. But we're all in universities teaching and researching. So look at where they are teaching, because the chances are, if you've got someone publishing books at this level, the chances are they've also got courses at university where they're teaching on it. So, for example, a few of obviously UCLan, at the University of Central Lancashire, where I am. It would be shameful if I didn't plug that, but it's not actually even called religious studies. It's just called religion, culture, and society. And the idea is that you learn not just about world religions, but you learn religion and what is religious life, and how it impacts culture and identity. So that's one. University of Wolverhampton, Stephen Gregg, Dr. Alan Thomas, these guys, they're there. George Chryssidis was there for a while as well. And King's College London is where Inform is based. So these are good universities to aspire to. And Lancaster University, which I'm going to get absolutely slaughtered for mentioning because they're a rival for UCLan, but Lancaster Uni has a different, I don't agree with all of the research coming out, but they've got some amazing, Professor Kim Knott is there, and she's amazing. And Open University actually is also a really good department. Loads of prominent researchers come out of the OU. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is looking for a degree that has NRMs or new religious movements or kind of minority religious movements modules. And if they've got a module, the chances are they've got researchers that can teach it, but also not many universities have it as part of their degree,
right?
Even if it's a religious studies degree or whatever. And so it's really, when you see that, it's like gold dust. The field of studying this is really, really small. Like, we know each other. We all know each other. Like, I think I've had dinner with like half of the guys I'm mentioning, because we go to conferences and then there's like the buffet, and we know each other. It's a really small field. And so when you see a university course that has a module on that, that's gold dust. And so then that will give you enough foundation for you to kind of work out, okay, do I want to do a master's by research or teaching? Then you can find that. And normally by the end of a degree, you've built up enough relationship with someone to then ask them to be a PhD supervisor. And whilst you're on your degree, go to conferences. We are not a well-funded field. Again, if there's any rich people listening and they want to fund research, great. But that means that our conferences are relatively cheap and easy to get to, normally in a central location. So when it's physical, but they're all online at the moment. And probably there will be a new model of half online, half not online in a post-COVID world. Yeah. So
is there a place where those conferences would be announced, or is it does it go through the university portals and things like that?
No. Sometimes some universities are good at that, some aren't. It just depends on the uni. The conferences are always organised by the same people. So you've got the British Association for Sociology and Religion, BASRA, as it's affectionately known. And then you've got Inform. They always do conferences. I would argue that BASRA, they just have religious studies conferences. They're not necessarily, but Inform are very specific on this field. You then also have CENSAM, which is CENNSAM. They often have like panels and discussions in this field as well. And then if you want to go international, there's a place called CESNUR, CESNUR, which is the Centre for, I've got it written down here a minute, Centre for Studies on New Religions. And that another, Goliath in the field, Massimo Intravini runs that, and that's another. They sometimes do conferences, but just go to those websites and ask to be on the mailing list. So Inform do seminars. They don't even do huge conferences. They just do a seminar on a theme. You log in. At the moment, it's online, and then you just listen, and it's really interactive. And the beauty of Inform, in particular, to flag that up, is they really often encourage A-level students to attend as well, because they love being accessible, and you get people who are in minority religions in the same conference. So it might be an academic doing a talk, followed by someone doing a talk about being a medium and how that impacts their life. And sometimes even in the room, they've said, "Oh yeah, I feel a spirit speaking to me."
Oh my goodness! Wow, yeah, that's interesting.
You'll love it. I'll get you in at the next one. I'll make sure you know. There's one coming up.
Yes, definitely let me know. That's something that's up my street, down my alley, whatever way you would want to describe it. So is there anything you think is important to add to the information that we're putting out today that we haven't covered before we say goodbye?
Yeah, one huge thing, which I think comes from my research, but I'm also quite passionate about telling people about. People who are in cults, if that's the word that people use, or in new religious movements, minority religions, they are individual people who have free will. And this idea that they are brainwashed essentially assumes that they are incapable of making decisions for themselves. Now, I'm not saying coercion isn't used, but I think it's really important that when we continue to inform ourselves about these groups and continue to learn about them, which I love that you're doing through this podcast, always try and remember that they could just be your next door neighbor, and you would never know a difference half the time. It's only when it gets to a point of, atrocity or tragedy that we actually have them on our radar. But you are literally you've probably got someone in your street who's part of a minority religion. I mean, in America, for example, in any given time, you can have 5,000 different minority religions operating with over 300,000 new converts a year. So, they're everywhere, but they're also normal people with agency, free will. And so I think that's my message to everyone. Always remember that it could be your next door neighbor, your cousin, your uncle, and you might never know. Remembering that, I think, helps continue in the battle of making sure they have their free will, their rights, their civil liberties, which I think personally, a lot of these individuals have had taken away from them often. Okay,
well, just before we finish, then, is there a link that you would like to read out for the survey for people to access to help you with collecting this data, or is it a really, really long?
Yeah, it's a really long with lots of different individual letters and numbers, because it's a special link. So if it can go in a link in your bio or something, I don't know how podcasts work.
I'll put it on the episode description. I'll put it on the social medias, and I'll post it on the website as well, so that it's in all the different places people might visit. So thank you so much, Ed, for coming and joining us today. Congratulations on getting to your PhD, and good luck with finishing it. I hope we get to watch some updates as your publications get released and your research gets put into a book.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And hopefully we can get the roundtable discussion together after the survey is closed, so that we can have an in-depth discussion about terminology with some of you and your peers. Absolutely. Yeah, it's just a very busy time. It's conference season looming. So I think sort of come August, I mean, this is coming out later in the year, but yeah, come August, come September, we'll all have a bit more freedom. Fantastic. Brilliant. Thanks, Ed. Enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah, you too. See you later. Thanks. Bye. That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, please do so by emailing me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.